Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. I saw Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, walking hand in hand through the city of London with Blythe Masters, the inventor of the credit defraud swap. The two were singing. We're off to see the price fixers, the wonderful fixers of ours. They rig the rates of interest swaps, oil, bond, silver, and gold bars. Oh, they rig, 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 they rig. Stacy?
They rig only for themselves, not for you and I.
As coup, not they rig for it is them that they rig for them. That's Hemingway, I believe, said that.
Yes, well, the curtains have been pulled back. Everybody sees that there is no such thing as a free market.
And Jamie has very small testicles.
They might see that too. He did talk about opening the kimono. And when he did that, of course, not only did we see what you just referred to, but we did see that we have no free markets, that all the prices everywhere are rigged, and that's the headline here. Everything is rigged. The biggest price-fixing scandal ever. The Illuminati were amateurs. The second huge financial scandal of the year reveals the real international conspiracy. There's no price the big banks won't fix. London-based firm ICAP, the world's largest broker of interest rate swaps, is being investigated by American authorities. Regulators are looking into whether or not a small group of brokers at ICAP may have worked with up to 15 of the world's largest banks to manipulate ISDA-FIX, a benchmark number used around the world to calculate the price of interest rate swaps. Max, this is a $379 trillion market, and it's like a double rig here because we've had the LIBOR scandal, which these very same banks rigged LIBOR rates, global interest rates, and this is rigging the swaps on top of the interest rates.
Well, it's a heinous crime, and we've been reporting about it for a while. You know, ICAP is a company. It's a interbroker, dealer, banker, dealer, interbroker, arbitrage, wielding, money spinning fraudster. We've been talking about. They do an annual charity event where they get celebrities to come in and rub themselves against the bankers, and everyone gets really excited. But they're a sleazy, no good group of scoundrels here in London. And we've reported on it for years, and I tell the police, I say to the police, that's where the crooks are. That's where the terrorists are. But they don't act.
So this is a $379 trillion market, and who buys these interest rate swaps? They're municipalities, corporations, and sovereign governments. And what they're trying to do is manage the risk that interest rates might go up or down, whatever that they don't want. So they sell basically the interest rate to the banks like JP Morgan, and they're supposed to take the risk. But now they're actually, we find out, not only were they manipulating interest rates, but they're also manipulating these interest rate swaps. The banks implicated include Barclays, UBS, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, and the Royal Bank of Scotland. We've also talked about this sort of nexus of London as the center of all these frauds. And of course, this is ICAP, which is a London-based firm. But it was the desk in New Jersey, which was involved in this crime. There are 20 guys on the ICAP desk there controlling the interest rate swap prices. And they are known as Treasure Island because they were coining so much money. According to the reports, the commission is also looking at whether or not employees at ICAP may have intentionally delayed publication of swap prices, which in theory could give someone, bankers, cough, cough, a chance to trade ahead of the information. So again, Max, we have another case of front running. We see this in high frequency trading. We see this in the treasury market. Time after time, they're front running all of these big market moving numbers.
Yeah, I'm going to bust an ICAP in your ass. You know, that's the thing. I don't know. They say it's Treasure Island. It's out there in New Jersey, and they're committing fraud. But, of course, the CEO knows about it. I forget his name, Schwartzman or something like that. Look it up on Google. He's just a scoundrel and a crook. You know, I invite him to come on the show and defend himself. But, of course, he would risk, meeting up with the wrath of the people. I don't think he goes outside anymore. He just stays in this little hovel, guarded, like, don't let me out. They're out there. The people that I've stole money from, they're going to burn me to death. He's all hidden away and things like that.
And Matt Taibbi in this piece refers to the Illuminati, and still people around the world, anybody who should be there to help stop this fraud, ongoing rigging, all these benchmark prices around the world, Matt Taibbi says, all of them, whether it's LIBOR, whether it's credit default swap prices, whether it's gold, silver, jet fuel prices, energy prices, coal, all of these are set by, not by the free market, but by a few guys in a room. The price is fixed by them. They tell everybody what it is. So of course, all these stories collectively pointed to the same thing. These banks, which already possess enormous power just by virtue of their financial holdings in the United States, the top 6 banks, many of them the same names you see on the LIBOR and ISDAFIX panels, own assets equivalent to 60% of the nation's GDP, are beginning to realize the awesome possibilities for increased profit and political might that would come with colluding instead of competing. You know, this is a real, live, now happening. We can point to conspiracy, a global one. The interest rate swap market, Max, is $379 trillion. The global interest rate market, the LIBOR fixed market, is $500 trillion. So these are massive, massive markets that are happening now. You don't need to look to 500 years ago and whether or not the Illuminati controlled things back then.
Well, this is what I don't understand about people who are obsessed with the Bilderberg meeting, or they're obsessed about the Illuminati. As Matt Taibbi said, the current scams being perpetrated by ICAP and Barclays and these other banks are happening in real time, and they're reported every day in the paper. You don't need to go beyond that. You don't need to see who's anywhere connected to this criminality other than the actual criminals themselves. I don't care about the Bilderberg group, because we don't need to have a conspiracy theory about people that might or might not be committing crimes when we have actual criminal behavior being committed in real time, openly and tauntingly. It's just, I think the people who are upset with Bilderberg, I think it's an excuse for them not taking action. Instead of taking action against the guy who runs ICAP, they're saying, oh, we have to go after the Bilderberg, because they're too timid to go after the actual criminal. They're too lazy to go after the actual criminal.
And, you know, Matt Taibbi highlights some of the utter contempt they have for the population, where LIBOR was rigged, for example, on behalf of, for one broker who asked for it to be rigged by the submitter, the LIBOR submitter, who was going to submit the LIBOR rate for that day. And he did it in exchange for some day-old sushi. This was what the emails back and forth showed. So Matt Taibbi says, screwing around with world interest rates that affect billions of people in exchange for day-old sushi. That's the reality. It's not some like kings and monarchs in some secret castles out there. You know, this is together, just these two markets, LIBOR and interest rate swap markets. That's $800 trillion right there. That's 10 times bigger than the global economy.
Right. You know, I mentioned their celebrity get-togethers, and like a Gwyneth Paltrow will be at an ICAP celebrity do. Now, the subtlety of their criminality is about as subtle as the dress she was wearing recently at a celebrity event, where basically her entire butt was hanging out of this dress. You could almost, you know, read, you know, the pubic hairs and get an idea of what she was thinking. That's how transparent this dress was. That's how subtle ICAP's criminality is. It's so out in the open, so obvious, that I think people are just gobsmacked by it, or they blame the Bilderbergs because they're too lazy to do it. It has to be done to this ICAP guy.
Well, Matt Taibbi does point to the fact that, moreover, it's increasingly clear that both the criminal justice system and the civil courts may be impotent to stop them, even when they do get caught working together to game the system. And we saw this, of course, recently when there was a civil case in Manhattan against the LIBOR riggers. And what the judge said is that you can't bring an antitrust action against them because, in fact, they're not competing. So they are colluding. So therefore, it's not antitrust.
Right. That's right. Now, there should be anti-racketeering laws imposed. Now, I think we're going to end up going down the path of Maximilian Robespierre, who brought in this thing called the Reign of Terror. He had a scorched earth policy against banksters of his day. He said, forget it, forget the trial, head in the guillotine, chop, chop, let's move on. He killed like 50,000 people were executed by Robespierre's gang in the Reign of Terror. That would be a good start. That's where we start. I want to see that river red with bankster blood. Let's do it.
Well, Matt Taibbi concludes that if true that the criminal justice system will not touch these banksters, that would leave us living in an era of undisguised real-world conspiracy in which the prices of currencies, commodities like gold and silver, even interest rates and the value of money itself can be and may already have been dictated from above. Now, of course, the mainstream financial media, they mock and ridicule and laugh at the people who talk about Bilderberg and the Illuminati. But what do when a real-world conspiracy is right there in front of their face reporting on it? They act the opposite, just as ridiculous, because they refuse to believe that any conspiracy could possibly happen, that banksters are wealthy because of their wealth generation, and that they're better than the rest of us.
It's as Robespierre said, and I quote, "Terror is virtue, virtue is terror." Keep that in mind as we cleanse the system of the banksters.
Well, and speaking along this line of what Matt Taibbi is saying here is that all prices are rigged. Every single thing is fixed. Every single benchmark rate which they interact with is rigged. So then we know that global, all monetary policy is based on helping these guys out. They're the ones that own the central banks, and so everything around us is a fabrication of their imagination. And Jeffrey Sachs, who was a former insider, was IMF economist, wrecking economies around the world. He's gone. Well, he's pulled back the curtain, and now he's ranting everywhere. And recently he's just said, "I meet a lot of these people on Wall Street on a regular basis right now. I'm going to put it very bluntly. I regard the moral environment as pathological, and I am talking about the human interactions. I've not seen anything like this, not felt it so palpably." And he says outright, these guys are crooks, and and I have to warn you, he said, they're going to get away with it.
Yeah, well, we met Jeffrey Sachs a couple of years ago, and I tipped him to this incredible scheme that's going on stage at the Kilconomics Festival, and I think that turned him, because before then he was trying to make sense of it and put it in the context of policy initiatives and failed policies, and now he understands these bankers have gone rogue, and until this river runs red, we're not going to be rid of the plague of banksters destroying the economies and our lives going forward. Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Australia and speak with Das, the Madonna of economists, author of Extreme Money. Das, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Nice to be with you, Max.
All right, Das, tell us about Japan. They're taking monetary policy where no central bank has before gone. Tell us what's happening and what could be the consequences.
Well, essentially, Japan has adopted the kamikaze strategy, because having done nothing for a long period of time and the economy is in the doldrum, they've now got a three-pronged plan. Plan number one, spend more money than you have, so there's going to be a massive fiscal stimulus. Secondly, central bank intervention. Interest rates have been at zero for about 15, 16 years. So the central bank is buying assets. It's going to essentially double the money supply and double the size of the central bank balance sheet within a couple of years. And finally, they're going to do some structural reforms. But Max, it ain't going to work. What do you think? Is it going to work?
Well, let me cut in here for a second, because this idea that Japan is pursuing, that they are engaged in more quantitative easing, and of course they were the first major economy to go into this quantitative easing phase. They're up to quantitative easing round number 4, and it's used by other countries like the UK and the United States as an example of why quantitative easing works. So they're using Japan as a case study of why it works, because Japan still maintains a vibrant export market. The economy is still functioning. It's the model, it's the poster child for the G20. So what do you see that everyone else seems to have gotten wrong, and in a global economy where so far we haven't seen the inflation, we haven't seen the problems that everyone predicted would come with quantitative easing?
Well, I don't think we're going to see inflation, but that's a separate issue. But let's look at Japan, okay? The reason their export industries worked is in the first few rounds of quantitative easing and so forth, the rest of the world economy was ticking along, which it's not. The first thing is, okay, let's say we flood the system with money and devalue the yen. The first thing is it going to help? The answer is probably not. The reason? Japanese exporters have relocated a lot of their plants overseas, so they don't get the benefit of a weaker yen. The next problem is the companies in Japan which export are companies which are such stellar stars as Sony and Sharp, who are very, very close to bankruptcy because they have been outcompeted in costs and innovation by the Koreans and other people. So it ain't going to work. What it's going to do, though, is the weaker yen is going to push up their energy bills. And that's not really good for Japan because it's a heavy energy importer, and we've seen all the electricity prices go up. And that's going to tip their trade balance, which is already negative, further into the black. I beg your pardon, the red. And then what's going to happen is their current account's going to turn around. And now we have the pincer movement. The first is savings in Japan today are lower than they were in the United States. And the problem with that is, as the government issues more and more bonds, the only buyer is the central bank. There's no other buyers left. So basically, they screwed on that front. But the other side is the current account, which has helped fund their deficit, is now going to turn around gradually over time. So it's not good news. So to go back to your question, if this is the poster child, the future does not augur well for the West.
Yeah, but Das, I asked, you haven't seen the inflation yet, and you were saying, well, it's not about inflation, or we wouldn't see inflation. But you just described a situation of a yen getting cheaper, being devalued, which would cause the price of oil to go higher, which would have a problem for the economy. Isn't that inflation, number one? Number two, again, it's the poster child for these G8, G20 nations who are able to manage the prices of things like bonds. They can manage the price of things like oil. They can manage the price of things like gold and silver because these things are traded on these futures exchanges, which are completely in the province of the cartel, of the Wall Street banks and the banks of the city. It's not a free market anymore. So we're not going to see any price signals. That's my question, Das. Have price signals been obliterated by the terrorists, Das?
Well, let's leave the price signals just for 1 second. Come back to your question on inflation. I think you've got to separate out two things. Inflation in general and the inflation problem specifically in Japan because of the imported energy. Commodity inflation is going to be a feature with quantitative easing around the world. But in terms of the type of inflation you need to bring down the debt burden, you're not going to get it because you need a whole bunch of conditions for inflation. Number one, you need excessive money supply. My God, have we got that? But the second thing, you need velocity of money, circulation of money. Fractional banking is broken. So that's not going to work. You need demand excesses over supply. That doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And finally, because we've been in 30 years where the central banks have told us they have inflation under control, inflationary expectations are low. So you're not going to get that. But anybody who actually is an importer of commodities like Japan is going to get whacked. And that's going to have a terrible effect down the track. Because if they create the 2% inflation they're looking for, what's going to happen is their bond yields are going to go up. 24% of the government's expenditure is on interest. So if you push up rates from where they are today to 3%, roughly about two-thirds to three-quarters of their tax revenues and their spending will be on interest, which is unsustainable. Now, coming back to your question on price signals, anybody who thinks markets have basically been free, I think is under a bit of an illusion because many of these prices have, quite correctly, as you say, been controlled by a small number of banks. This is not only in financial markets. We know from trade practices and anti-competition type of cases around the world, price fixing is something which occurs in all industries. And given the incentives in finance to manipulate certain prices, it's hardly surprising that's occurred. But that should be prosecuted under existing laws because those are crimes, market manipulation offenses. It should be. The question to my mind is, will they be prosecuted?
Okay, but Das, you say that Japan is about to enter into a horrific consequence of their mismanagement of their economy. How do we know if that's going to happen? How do we know that's true if we can't rely on the price signal? In other words, if the price signal is broken, as you've just described it, and we have no way of knowing, therefore, that the economy is broken, because there's no way to judge that the economy is broken. We just have a corrupt cartel in place that is making money available cheaply to speculators, who then in turn use that money to destroy the price signal by just keeping the price of these futures markets completely under their thumb. So how do we know if it's broken if we don't get a good price signal to us?
Well, I think fundamentally, the real issue is going to be what happens to the real economy. How many people are unemployed? How many people have income? How many people feed themselves? How many people can buy healthcare? How many people can buy aged cares? I think you're getting too obsessed about the financial markets.
Wait a minute. Let me cut in for a second, Das, because you're saying, okay, what really matters is how people are dealing with the economy. If they can't eat, it doesn't matter if the government says that there is no inflation because they can't eat. So therefore, their only recourse is what? What are the people of Japan going to do? Or what are the people in Europe going to do? The United States, they're being disenfranchised. Wealth is being transferred at an epic scale from the Commonwealth to the elite terrorists who run the banking system. What's their recourse, Das? What are they doing down there in Australia? Are they buying gold? Are they convorting with koala bears? What's happening in Australia?
Well, I don't know about convorting with koala bears. I've never really seen how that's done, but I'm sure you know. But leave that to one side. I think what we're going to see is the type of backlash we've seen in Italy with the five-star movement and the dissident movements around the world. Now, whether that's going to work or not, I don't know. But fundamentally, it's going to be a social and political issue. And don't forget, in the 1920s and 1930s, fascism came to power on the back of the middle classes who'd had their savings and their life wealth wiped out by inflation in the Weimar Republic. So I think that's where it'll be resolved. I think the financial markets is going to be a bit of a sideshow to that.
All right, now I just want to come back to something you said earlier, just for the viewers out there who follow these things in terms of the terminology that is used. We were talking about inflation, and you were talking about the price of oil going higher, but you were describing, correct me if I'm wrong, a scenario of cost push inflation. Can you, just for the sake of our listening audience and viewing audience, kind of review how this differs from other forms of inflation, Das?
Well, I think there's demand inflation, which is what the world really needs. If you actually look at what the central banks are trying to do, they're trying to create growth and demand pull inflation, because that would basically create the growth which allows the debt to be gradually run down. They can't get that. What we're seeing is quantitative easing, particularly by the US Federal Reserve, with the devaluation of the dollar, because most commodities are traded in dollars, pushes up the price of those commodities, which is affecting, for instance, Japan, which has also scored an own goal by devaluing the yen. But the fundamental thing that it does do is push up those costs of commodities, and that's a huge issue. To go back to your enfranchisement issue, is in emerging markets where things like food and energy are a huge part of the actual spending of individuals. So in places like Indonesia and Bangladesh, we're going to see a massive problem for the poorer people in the world. And I think that's the bigger issue. So there's a difference between the type of inflation they want and the type of inflation they create.
Right, so if the goal is to create cost pull inflation, that would also imply that wages would be pulled higher. But again, the cartel, who prefers to pay people at absolute slave rate, rock bottom Chinese slave market minimums, they don't want people having their wages inflated or pulled higher, do they? Because that would destroy their monopoly profits. So isn't it true, Das? And I read your book, Extreme Money, where you delve into the machinations of the global financial system. Isn't it true, Das, that we have a situation where these bankers have created a new global economic paradigm where asset prices go up to make them wealthy, but wages never go up, and so nobody outside of that very small group ever participates in this inflationary bubble, Das?
I think there's certainly an element of truth in that, but I think let's look at it in two ways. One is, to be fair, many countries now recognize, particularly, say, the administration of the US is trying to push up the minimum wage. We can have a debate about whether that's going to be sufficient. I don't think it's going to be sufficient. But I think fundamentally, one of the key issues going forward is to be able to address the question of the wages as a percentage of GDP versus things like corporate profits. And that's an issue that's bubbling along. But I suspect there is no will among policymakers to deal with that issue. But in Japan, it creates an interesting problem. On the one hand, they want to get more competitive. On the other hand, they want to push up wages, which makes them less competitive in a global sense. So there's an inherent contradiction in the Japanese position.
Finally, Das, I want to ask you something, late-breaking story here. The CFTC are investigating the rigging of interest rate swap markets. Tell us about the particular market, this particular market, and the significance of fixing prices and allowing for front-running. So this is on top of the LIBOR scandal, which some thought was the biggest market manipulation in history. Now we have something even bigger. Tell us about it.
This is a very famous thing, what used to be the Telerate 19901 screen, where all the dealers put in their prices at 11 a.m. and it was used to set swap rates for settlement, etc. And basically, it's exactly the same problem as LIBOR. You've got a bunch of people putting in quotes with huge incentive structures to manipulate that number for profit. And so, hardly surprisingly, what happened in LIBOR happened here. And I think this is quite an interesting story. And in many ways, it's a bigger story than probably the LIBOR scandal is, because this is a much smaller group of people, and it was never really policed in the same way theoretically that LIBOR was. So it's a bigger story. But the fantastic thing about both of these stories is it's very difficult to forget legislative and prosecutor traction on these, because nobody really can figure out who's lost and who's won. But I think, watch this space, I think you're going to see a couple of big banks, because the actual swap market is dominated by 6 or 8 banks, much less than the number you see in LIBOR. So I think you're going to see something there. But the key thing here is, until we change incentive structures in finance, none of this is going to change. If you've got young blokes who basically have huge incentives in a bonus sense to manipulate numbers where they think they can get away with it, and the fundamental thing is these rules are very, very vague. They're not policed in any way, and that's going to be a huge problem. But I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because the CFTC will undoubtedly be joined by other regulators around the world.
Yeah, well, once again, the price signal completely destroyed. All right, Das, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Good to be with you, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Das, author of Extreme Money. If you'd like to send us an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.